Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the EU government system. So this is a lecture that is offered within the EU in Focus series. And the idea is to give you the basic notions about how the EU government system is structured, what are the relationships, the mutual relationships among the different EU institutions. You will learn that what is so unique with this system is that there is no term of comparison for the EU anywhere in the world. You know that the process of joining together of the different countries is something that is very peculiar to the European continent. You can't think of a supranational integration that is so deep and so large in any other continent. You can think of some agreements, often trade agreements, but nothing that is so political in nature and nothing that has become as deep as in the EU, sharing the same currency in so many of the member states is, I think, a clear sign of disintegration. So, of course, if you integrate policies that are so important, like monetary policy, you also need to have institutions that govern those policies. So today we will learn what these institutions are. Again, because the EU experiment is so unique, you should not expect something that is comparable to what you know better, either the US system or any other national system, because we will learn the EU government system is a hybrid and it's unique. We need first to familiarize with the main EU institutions. There is here a list. Some of them are more important, others I wouldn't say are less important, but just they have a more limited scope. The most important institutions are those that are highlighted in deep blue, because these are the institutions that either take decisions or they monitor that the decisions that are taken are then implemented and the EU treaties and main principles are implemented. Then we have other bodies that give advice and another body, the European Court of Auditors, that reviews the spending of the EU. So, deep blue color for the most prominent institutions, light blue color for those that have more limited powers and scope. So, looking first at the deep blue colored institutions. We have the European Commission, we have the Council of the EU, we have the European Parliament, the European Council, and the European Court of Justice. I hope you can all read well the screen. Yeah. Okay. So, you see that none of these institutions compares in terms of names. I mean, probably you would expect the word president, but it does not appear there, does it? You would expect the word Congress. It's not there, but we have Parliament, and we have European to distinguish from the national parliaments. Maybe you would expect to have the different functions labeled, like executive branch, legislative branch. That's not there. So the first effort we have to make is to familiarize with institutions that have names that are as unique as the European Union. Also, there is a little bit of repetition, the Council of the EU and then the European Council. How do they compare? Are they the same thing? No, they're not. So, let's have a look at them one by one. And I will pick them in terms of, let's say, political prestige and political powers. The first institution I would like to pick up is the European Council. What is the European Council? This is an institution that only meets on the basis of emergency. Otherwise, they meet at least twice every semester. So you understand it's not a permanent institution in the sense that it is physically settled to be there daily. It doesn't have to do with daily activities. It is, let's say, a political guide for the EU. It is political leadership at its highest level. As a matter of fact, this institution represents the heads of government of the different member states. So, Mr. Cameron from UK, Mrs. Merkel from France, Mr. Renzi from Italy. So this is highest political leadership at the national level. They join together. They meet at least twice a semester. They can also meet more frequently if necessary, like in times of crisis. You have heard that we have gone through a very serious crisis with Greece. Greece had to be rescued. Important decisions had to be taken, whether money should be loaned to Greece and under what conditions. And for this reason, the European Council met more frequently. Now we have an immigration crisis. So you see, crises are actually not so rare. And on the basis of some justification, the European Council can meet more frequently. Otherwise, it meets on average twice a semester, twice, 4 times, well, depending. So here we have political leadership represented at the highest level. So what is the goal of this institution? To settle the medium and long-term agenda of the EU, to give a mission, goals to the EU, which are medium and long term. But they're not there, to stay on a daily basis and monitor that everything is done, because you can understand that these political leaders have a lot to do at home. So they will have to be back home and take care of their constituencies. They have to take care of implementation of the program of the national government. They will have to respond to the demands of their nationals. So the European Council is the institution that gives political leadership for goals that are medium and long term. Then, what are the institutions that do the policy making? So what are the institutions that work on a more permanent basis? We have the European Commission, the Council of the EU, and the European Parliament. You see this triangle. This is the decision-making triangle of the EU. Once the European Council has given the agenda, this has to be translated by these 3 institutions. So, what is the first institution that activates? The first institution that activates is the European Commission, because the European Commission works as a sort of independent agency. Here you don't find political leaders. Here you have an independent body that is made of experts, policy experts in the different fields. They have a staff that is, for the largest part, recruited through public selections on the basis of merits, on the basis of knowledge, on the basis of policy expertise. So this is what the European Commission is about. It is a technocratic body, and what they do is to instruct legislation, in particular to start legislation. They would draft legislative proposals that would then be voted by the Council of the EU and the European Parliament. So, again, we have the European Council that recommends the agenda, recommends what the priorities are for the EU. Then we have the European Commission that draft policy proposals on the basis of the indications given by the European Council. Actually, the scope of the legislative proposals of the Commission is not only limited to the European Council recommendation. The European Commission is there working on a permanent basis to listen to everyone. They're not political, they're technocratic, they have to translate into draft legislation that is affordable, that is in line with the main rules of the EU, that is technically valid. The different demands that are forwarded, first of all, by the European Council, but it could also be by other voices. I mean, even the European citizens can petition in order to have a policy proposal drafted by the Commission. So it's not that the Commission only listen to top political leadership, they also have to listen to stimuli, to demands that come from society, that come from organized groups. It can be parties, or it can be even the European Parliament and the Council of the EU, the other two main institutions, pushing the European Commission to start the legislative initiative. What is important is that in the EU, the legislative initiative is exclusive of the European Commission, meaning legislation can only be started by the European Commission. There is not another body that can start legislation. Not even the European Council. So important it is, so political it is, but they do not legislate. They just give recommendations. So, you understand this is already quite interesting. The European Union system is framed in such a way that it is a technocratic body, not a political body, to initiate legislation on the basis of demands. But this has to be done by a technocratic body, not only because there is quite a lot of expertise that is required in an entity as complex and difficult under certain aspects as the EU, but also because it is believed that if it is a technocratic body, this will be less biased, this will be more politically neutral, and this will be more in the interest of everyone. Don't forget that the European Union is an entity made of nowadays 28 member states, 500 million, so many nested interests in this huge entity. And the fact it is a technocratic body to start legislation is a guarantee of the fact that legislation does not follow the interests of specific groups, but it is made instead in the name, in the interest of, let's say, the EU as a whole. As a matter of fact, the European Commission is also a guarantor of the EU treaties, so the basic written rules of the EU. In the US, you have a constitution. In the EU, there's no constitution, but there is the founding treaties, yeah? The founding treaties of the EU that have then been enriched by other treaties that have followed over the decades. This constitutes the, let's say, constitutional principles of the EU. And the European Commission is in charge of being guarantor of those treaties, of those principles. So any legislation that is drafted needs to comply with those principles. Now, Once the European Commission has drafted legislation, it is in the hands of the Council of the EU and the European Parliament to pass or amend or drop that legislation. So, the European Commission initiates legislation, but then the final word is in the hands of European Parliament and Council of the EU. They will both have to vote or amend the proposed legislation. Okay, let's have a look now at how these different institutions are structured inside. So, what is their composition? You see, it's quite a complex figure. It's not, it's probably not so intuitive, but remember that the European Union institutional system is a system that has been created over the decades, starting with only 6 member states up to 28. So it has to be adjusted accordingly. There are different, let's say, visions within the EU, whether the EU should be a supranational body that decides everything or at least most, or whether it should be intergovernmental, should be respectful of the sovereignty of the member states, and so its power should be limited and national governments should have a say. So supranational versus intergovernmental. These are two different principles that are forwarded by different countries. You could compare this with federal versus decentralized. And let's say that both visions are somehow integrated within the EU. So I pick up again one of these institutions, I pick up the European Council. We say that this is made by the heads of state or heads of government of the member states and sets the EU's political goals. So that's a repetition, right? Then, what does the European Council do apart from giving the medium and long-term agenda? Does the European Council appoint any other body? Yes, they do. To start with, they appoint the president of the European Council. Because the European Council, as we said, meets minimum twice every semester. So when they need their agenda to be somehow coordinated and to be somehow drafted by someone. So there is a president of the European Council who lasts 2.5 years and who has exactly this task. The task of coordinating the works of the European Council. It's not that he's a president the way you could conceive a president in the United States. Not at all. He's not the president of the European Union in the sense of most prominent political figure. Not at all. He's only someone who coordinates the work of the European Council. So he's elected by the European Council for a 2.5-year mandate, and often, or let's say until now, he has always been a former prime minister from one of the member states. Currently, his name is Donald Tusk, and he used to be the prime minister of Poland. No more so. The European Council also appoints the High Representative for the Union in Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. What is it? Basically, a sort of Minister of Foreign Affairs of the EU. Because foreign affairs is so important. Imagine, for example, these days of crisis in the Middle East. Who should be the speaker for the EU. We have this figure of foreign minister of the EU who can do all the diplomatic work and, let's say, concentrate all the different duties in terms of establishing diplomatic relationships and favoring, facilitating the dialogue between the EU and other countries. Okay, then let's move to composition of the European Parliament. The European Parliament is directly elected by the European people. So there is around 500 million people in the European Union. Those who are over 18 are allowed to vote in the European elections. The European elections take place every 5 years. And in those elections, the citizens vote not for European candidates, but national candidates who will be their representatives in the EU. So in Italy, we have a number of seats in the European Parliament that are allocated, and we appoint our representatives in the Parliament. So there will be elections as normal elections with different parties, different candidates for the different parties, and we decide who should be our representatives in the European Parliament. So in the end, in the European Parliament, you will have representatives, political representatives from the parties, from the different member states. So a sort of Babel. Those of you who will come to Brussels will experience that. I mean, there is a language issue. The different works of the different committees are held in the different languages because all the EU languages are official languages. I mean, all the official languages of the national member states are official languages of the EU. So the works are conducted in more than 20 languages, and there are translators. So this is the way the European Parliament is elected. It is the only directly elected body of the EU. The other ones are all indirect through national governments. So this is quite important because it means that within all these institutions that we have seen, there is only one institution that has direct legitimacy, and that's the European Parliament. Looking again at who appoints whom, we say that the European Council is the summit of heads of state and heads of government of the member states. The European Parliament is elected by citizens. The European Council proposes the Commission President, and the name is then approved or ratified by the European Parliament. So we have the European Commission. We said it is the legislative initiator within the EU. This is made of a president. This president is proposed by the European Council, approved by the European Parliament, and then once the European President has been appointed, commissioners will be selected, one for every member state. And these commissioners will have portfolios dealing with different policy fields. Each portfolio deals with a different policy fields. So, European Council, European Parliament, European Commission. There is only the Council of Ministers that is left. Remember that we said that if the European Commission is the policy initiator, the legislative initiator, it is then the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers that pass legislation. We say that the European Parliament is directly elected. What about the Council of Ministers? The Council of Ministers is another summit. It is the summit of the ministers of the various member states. So we have a Council of Ministers for Finances, where you have the 28 ministers of finances who meet. But we also have a Council of Ministers for the Environment, where you have the 28 ministers of the environment of the member states. And the same with the different policy fields. You can imagine there are so many. Agriculture, for example, could be one. Immigration is another important policy field, especially these days. So the Council of Ministers is made of the specific ministers of every member state dealing with the different policy fields. And they meet on the basis of the policy which is at stake. So if it is a matter of discussing decisions that concern finances, you will have the ministers of finances. So you will have 28 ministers working. Of course, we do not have to be naive and believe that they can do all the work in one day. Their work is prepared. There is preparatory work that is done before. There are working groups, there are committees within the Council of Ministers. But you also have ministers who come from the different member states and meet for the final decision. This is the composition of the EU institutional framework and the way the different institutions are structured inside. Now, let's go back to the decision-making process before we move to questions. We said that we have the European Council that decides the medium-long-term agenda. Then we have the European Commission that initiates legislation. And then it's the turn of Parliament and Council of Ministers of the EU. I put Council of Ministers into brackets. It is commonly known as Council of the EU, but remember that this is composed of the ministers of the different member states. So many call it Council of Ministers. The European Commission starts the legislative proposal. This is then voted on by the European Parliament and the Council of the EU. They can approve the proposal the way it is. They can amend the proposal. In this case, if one of the two bodies makes an amendment, it has to be passed also by the other body. So imagine that the Commission sends a proposal to Parliament and Council. If the Parliament amends, these amendments have to be approved also by the Council. If they don't, the law is sent back. The law proposal is sent back to the Parliament until they find an agreement. There are three possible readings. So let's say three possibilities to find agreement between these two institutions. Otherwise, there is a conciliation committee. And if it doesn't work with conciliation, just the legislative proposal is rejected. We will learn in Brussels that this doesn't often happen. Usually, these two bodies or three bodies manage to find an agreement. There is a very consensual attitude of these institutions. They are so much used to work with different languages, different interests, different nations, of course, that in the end, they have developed ways, they have developed capabilities to compromise and usually come to consensus. So it is considered a real waste of time and energies. Imagine after ministers fly back and forth to Brussels, imagine then the law proposal is rejected. It's a complete waste of time and energy, and it's not good for the EU. So usually they do come to some kind of agreement. So this is the way decisions are taken in the EU. Once decisions have been taken, the European Commission also has to monitor that these decisions, so decisions that have become laws, are correctly implemented in the member states and policy meets the requirements, the legal requirements of the EU. So the Commission starts the process of legislation, but also has the duty of monitoring correct implementation in the member states. So this is what the whole process is about. There are problems with this, of course. The first problem is that this is new, this is different, this is unique. So this is not democracy the way we know it in the different member states. In the member states we're used to something so different from that that it's difficult to be familiarized and also happy with this. Because the system is so, let's say, dispersed in terms of powers, in terms of competencies. You have so many institutions that interact. You have representation of so many different entities, the member states, citizens through the European parties that are represented in the European Parliament, the European Commission that represents expertise, technocracy. I mean, there is so much in there, but in the end, who is to blame? Who is to blame for achievements and failures? This is not so clear. I mean, this is a system where competencies but also responsibilities are very much diffuse. And this way, it's difficult to put blame. It's not like in America, where you can put blame on Congress or on the president, and next time you vote, you can sanction either president or Congress. This is not the same way in the EU. Also because citizens are only voting for the European Parliament. They're not voting for the European Council, they're not voting for the European Commission, they're not voting for the Council of Ministers. So you understand that a major problem is that, is this really popular democracy? Is this really representative democracy? This is one of the main challenges of the EU. How to make the system really legitimate in the sense that it is of the people, for the people. Main challenge. Second challenge, how to create leadership in such a system. Because if we think of United States, for example, of course we see where political leadership is. But where is political leadership here? Political leadership here is collective. There is collective leadership. There is no individual leadership. And this makes, of course, the decision-making process more difficult, tiring. It has to be based on compromise. Don't forget the map of the European Union, 28 member states, some of which are called United Kingdom, France, Germany, others are called Italy, Spain, but then you also have Poland, Hungary, Romania, you have Greece, you have Latvia, you have Estonia, Lithuania, you have Luxembourg, you have Malta. So you have countries of 80 million and countries of 300,000. And they both are represented in the European Union. They have, in the European Council, they have same representation. Do they count the same way? Should they count the same way? Can we have the big countries deciding all? I'm afraid this is not possible. Or do we have Western countries, wealthier countries, deciding all? I'm afraid this is not possible. So to give representation to all the different interests within the EU also means making leadership more dispersed, diluted, maybe ineffective. Maybe there's no leadership in the EU. That's the problem. There is collective agreement, but not leadership. So one main challenge, how to make the EU more popular and legitimate. Second challenge, how to create leadership within the EU, and a leadership that is recognized by all the different parts. Third problem, how to conciliate intergovernmental with supranational. The European Council is clearly intergovernmental. We said heads of government of the different member states, so clearly intergovernmental. Council of the EU is also intergovernmental because you have the ministers of the different member states, so clearly intergovernmental. But then the European Commission is not. It's supranational. It's made of technocrats who are there to forward the mission, the basic principles of the EU, those that are written in the constitutive treaties of the EU. And this is supranational. They're not there to serve the interest of individual member states. They're there to protect the collective interests, the interests of the EU as federation. So, you understand intergovernmental, supranational, these are different visions, missions, interests that need to be accommodated. And the European Parliament is really in between, but it's more supranational than intergovernmental, yeah? Because it is creating a party system that tends to be more supranational with MPs, or better, EMPs, European members, MEPs, members of the European Parliament, who are there not to serve the interests of national parties or national constituencies, but really they are there to represent the European Parliament as if it was the parliament of a federal entity. So I would say that European Commission is the most supranational, followed by the European Parliament, but then European Council on the one hand, and Council of the EU definitely are intergovernmental bodies. So third challenge, how to accommodate intergovernmental with supranational visions. I just would like to be back to my first slide for a second, because we didn't mention European Court of Justice before. The European Court of Justice is the High Court of the EU and monitors that the laws are implemented. I said that the Commission is doing that, but they do it in different ways. The European Court of Justice is doing that in legal terms, while the European Commission is doing that more in a bureaucratic way, administrative way. So the European Court of Justice is the High Court that interprets. They also have to provide legal solutions to real cases on the basis of the EU written rules. So there are general rules that then need to be applied to real cases. And the European Court of Justice gave this interpretation where necessary. And also they intervene whenever there is a break to the EU laws in the member states. And there are even sanctions that are imposed, legal sanctions that are imposed. So this is the European Court of Justice, very important institution. Then we have other institutions in light blue. We said European Court of Auditors. They monitor the expenses of the EU, so very technical body. And then we have two bodies that give advice, Economic and Social Committee and Committee of the Regions. These are two committees that are experts in issues of, let's say, federalism, decentralization, powers of the different regions of the EU. In a sense, the Committee of the Regions is there to make sure that the interests of the different regions are taken into consideration. Okay, so it is, let's say, in a federal structure, that would be the body that protects the different states, yeah? And even within states, the different areas. So this is what the Committee of the Regions is about, and the Economic and Social Committee is instead made of representatives of employers, unions, so they are there to be consulted just, you know, on major labor decisions, for example. Okay, so this is the broad framework. Of course, you understand that a whole course could be devoted to the EU institutional system, so we're just summarizing. This is just to have some flavor of it, but this is the starting point. This is already telling of how unique this system is, its problem, its current challenges. So I would now like to open the floor for discussion. I'm ready to answer your questions.
You talked about how responsibility is diffused throughout the EU different bodies. Do you think that leads to a certain level of inefficiency? And what is the repercussions of that for the system as it tries to move forward?
Okay, I will answer one by one to the questions. Yes, it creates inefficiency. First of all, you have to think that the decision-making process is very long. In such a system, you can't have quick, effective decisions. Also because there is not a single body, there is not leadership that can take responsibility for decisions. So decisions have to be diffused and, you know, agreed upon by different bodies. So this makes the system very, very long. Often the results you have are lowest common denominator decisions, meaning not the best decisions possible, but the only viable ones on the basis of the positions that are available. So if you think that consuming time and also accepting compromises that are not always ideal, but the only possible ticket, is inefficiency? Yes, you can call it inefficient. But if you consider that that has been the way for 28 member states to progress together, then maybe there is another side of the coin. This is miracle.
This is just kind of a clarifying question. What system is currently used now to figure out how many seats each country gets in parliament, or is it just equal for each country?
It's not equal. There are quota. Larger countries get more, around 80. I mean, the largest countries get between 70 and 80. And the smallest countries get just a few, just a bunch. This is made in a way that overrepresent population in the small countries compared to the large countries. But this is also the way to get everybody represented. Again, there are countries of 300,000. Their weight compared to the 80 millions of Germany would be absolutely negligible. But the fact their population is overrepresented, they're still allocated a number of seats, make it possible for the small countries to ally, for example, sometimes against the large countries. So within the European Parliament, you have all these lines of division. The main one is the one opposing conservatives to liberals, let's say progressive. But other ones oppose North versus South, old member states versus new member states, West versus East, big versus small member states. These are all lines of division that operate within the European Parliament, and the fact that every member state is allocated a number of seats make it possible.
Does the European Court of Justice hold precedence over individual nations' courts?
Yes, yes. There is a hierarchy in the legal system, and the EU legislation, including the judicial body of the EU, which is the European Court of Justice, come first. And so there can't be national legislation that contradicts, and there can't be any act of the national court that contradicts the European Court of Justice.
I was wondering what degree of influence one European country had on others, specifically with the immigrant crisis. So I know recently Germany decided to restrict the amount of immigrants coming into Munich. Is this something, since it's a crisis the whole European Union is facing, that can be discussed in the Union and they can actually debate on? Or is it about the inner workings of the country itself?
The influence they exert on each other is very big. If you consider, for example, what happens with Greece, I mean, Greece has a government which is very much monitored and even guided by the European Union, meaning also the other national governments of the European Union. In terms of the economy, for example, there is a lot of mutual influence, lots of reciprocal monitoring. For example, the budget of every member state is sent to the Commission and is reviewed by the European Council before it actually gets voted in the national parliaments. This is because also the other governments want to have a say, in the sense that if there is one country that is deviating from the conditions of the Eurozones, the other countries intervene and redirect policy. So the mutual influence and monitoring is very strong. We have seen that over the past years with the budgetary policy very much. I mean, they tell you, no, you shouldn't do this, you should privatize, you should cut these expenditures, and so on. Before this is approved in the national parliament, they give you guidance. And this is done, of course, by the Commission that is very technocratic, as we said, but also by the European Council, where you have the national governments represented with their prime ministers. So lots of mutual influence. Of course, one criticism that is addressed to the EU is that not all governments are equal. And of course, France and Germany count more. There is this sort of alliance which is historical between Germany and France within the EU. They cooperate a lot. They also meet outside the EU summits, and they sometimes prepare their strategy in order to be ready when there is an EU summit. And they together count more than, of course, Latvia, Estonia, but even Italy, Spain. So that's the problem with mutual influence. Some say that this EU is too much shaped by the German interests and vision. Concerning immigration specifically, we are in an emergency situation. There hasn't been time enough for the EU to really take joint initiatives and coordinate, I would say. But there will be a European Council that will deal with this, which is going to meet specifically to deal with the immigration crisis. Let's see what happens. This is a very sensitive issue. I mean, you understand that delegating decisions to the EU on borders, who to allow in, especially in days of fear of terrorism, that's very critical.
Is there an EU institution that acts as the buffer if Parliament can't have an agreement, or if different institutions act out of line or try to take different positions?
Okay, so as I said, the European Commission initiates legislation that is then voted by the Parliament and the Council of the EU. If the two do not find agreement, because I mean, each of these two institutions find a common position, whatever the position is, but they have their own ways, their mechanism, let's say procedures, to come to a final position. Once these two final positions are confronted, if they're not in the same line, as I said, they can amend legislation, but then it has to be sent back to the other body, to the other, you can call it chamber. I mean, think of European Parliament and Council of the EU as two chambers of the Congress, yeah? In the US, you have House of Representatives and Senate. And here you can think of European Parliament and Council of the EU a bit in the same way. So, if one chamber amends legislation, it has to be approved by the other chamber. It can also be sent back again with other amendments. This can be done up to 3 times. After this, because there hasn't been a common position, there is a conciliation committee. In this conciliation committee, you have representatives of the Parliament, representatives of the Council of the EU, plus representatives of the European Commission who work as facilitators. They work in small numbers and try to find an agreement, try to pass a text that is acceptable both to Parliament and Council of the EU. If they do not manage to, the proposal is just rejected. But as I said, this happens really very rarely because it takes so long. I mean, sometimes it is months, sometimes it is years until you come to third reading and conciliation committee, that it is not in the interest of anyone to reject. It is in the interest of everyone to find some agreement, even if it's really lowest common denominator.
You said that the leadership in the EU system is based on collective agreement and not direct leadership. And it seems that it would be exceedingly difficult to maintain that kind of ideal as a functional and sustainable decision-making policy in that system. If you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. This is very challenging, and it's probably the main challenge together with how to make the EU more democratic. But can you imagine of the EU appointing a president like in the US? I mean, a president who is popularly elected. Wonderful, that's democracy. But who should this guy be? In what language should this guy campaign? From what country? Would the rest of the EU accept a British president or a German president or a French? And again, what should be the language? Because, I mean, to campaign, you need to connect with a constituency. And the language barrier is not to be underestimated. and also the direct knowledge you have of national problems. So who would be the most credible figure for that role? Very difficult to imagine. I don't think we're close to that at all. I don't think it will come anyway soon. But this leaves us with a problem of leadership. I mean, you have an entity which is so big, which has so many responsibility, which has one of the currencies of reference worldwide, the largest market in the world with 500 million. I mean, okay, there is China, but the aggregate GDP of the EU is, of course, bigger than the Chinese. So really it is an entity which is a potential to exert the role of leader, but it doesn't have means to exert political leadership. And of course, if you do not have means for political leadership, it is also difficult to exert economic leadership, cultural leadership, any kind of leadership. You understand? So that's a question that has no answer. Nobody has the answer. It's a dilemma. I mean, the EU has grown too much, too big to fail, but how to transform this into something that is more similar to governments, the way we know them? How to make it more legitimate? How to make the EU play the role it would deserve if we think in terms of economic power, but that it lacks in terms of political power.
I was just wondering if whether or not a country has adopted the euro affects the amount of representation they have in EU institutions, like if it's only based on population or if there's other factors that count that.
In real fact, there are summits where only representatives from the euro countries are invited. For example, when the finance ministers of the member states meet, there is a broader meeting for the 28 member states, and there is a restricted meeting for those countries that belong to the eurozone. And that's normal because they have to coordinate in different ways. They do not have to with UK that keep their own currency. But I would say that within the European Council in particular, where you have representation of all 28 member states, it doesn't work that way. And that's something a little bit annoying because you have countries that are committed to become members of the Eurozone, just they do not have the economic power to. Okay, I'm thinking of Eastern European countries. They have joined later, they have made amazing efforts to make their economies market economies coming from a communist background. So they're not ready yet. Some have already joined, some others are clearly not ready yet. But then you have countries like UK that have, all the criteria in place to fit the parameters, of course, but they don't want to give up their currency and they don't want to be in. But then at this point when you have the European Council deciding on the future of the Eurozone, well, the UK is also there. And their Prime Minister votes on decisions that are very influential for the future of the Euro. So is this appropriate? Some start to question that, but you know that there is an open discussion between the EU and the UK. And probably there will be a referendum soon in the future about membership in the EU. This has been promised by the Prime Minister David Cameron, and probably it will happen. So we don't know whether in the future the UK will still be a member of the EU.
Can it be seen as a security risk having all 28 heads of state in the same place at one time? Have there been terrorist attacks on it?
That is serious. I mean, that's true. It is a problem. First of all, we don't have the 28 heads of state. We have the 28 heads of government plus heads of state in cases like France, because they have a different government system. So they don't only have a prime minister as in all the other European countries. They also have a president who is directly elected by citizens, so he also takes part. So we have, let's say, the heads of government, so the prime ministers plus some presidents. It is a risk, so the measures that have to be taken are very, very serious. It has also become more and more difficult to host these summits because, especially in times of crisis, the protest against leaders has become very fierce with public manifestations against. And so on the occasion you have these big summits, you have a lot of protest in the streets. And so there are places where it is clearly difficult to handle. Sometimes they have met in security areas like military areas, but in very special occasions. They tend to do that in capital cities or, let's say, prominent places because, you know, they have cultural values and so on. Oh, let me say one thing in this respect. There is a rotating presidency of the EU, which means there is every 6 months a different state that is hosting these summits. This is done in order not to have these summits always in either Brussels, London, or Paris, but there is this rotation. Every 6 months, a different member state hosts these summits, which also means lots of organizational work. So it's never in the same place. So I have a question. How do you find all this? Is it easy? Is it difficult to understand? Who says this is easy? Okay. Who says this is difficult? Come on, there is no prize to win. I say this is difficult. Who's with me? Okay, this is difficult. One problem with this is that European citizens understand more or less the way politics work in their own system, but they don't understand anything of the European system. Ask in the streets, ask to people, ask to your Italian friends, ask if you live with local hosting families, if they know what is the European Commission, what is the European Council, who appoints whom, they will not know. So you understand this is dangerous. This also makes the people unhappy. They think this is not transparent at all. They think these institutions are far away, maybe corrupt. Certainly they don't work in the interest of the normal people, because what do they know of normal people? They're so far away. So you understand that creating this lack of knowledge, this distance, is also very detrimental for the quality of democracy, because you don't trust institutions you don't understand, basically. Yeah? So this is a serious problem. Probably now you know more about the EU institutional system than the average European. I bet on that. We do a little test. You will tell me, okay? You will make an effort to ask the Italians you meet whether they know about these institutions. Make some, questions to them and see what they answer.
You said that often France and Germany, among probably other players, will strategize before entering into discussions about legislature. I'm wondering what the incentive or the motivation. The incentive or the motivation for staying in that kind of relationship where Germany, for example, has such a higher GDP
Yeah.
and like success rate then, and to stay in that relationship where they have to support a country like Greece that has to be bailed out? Like, why even stay in the...
The Franco-German cooperation dates back to the after World War. So often problems in Europe started because of war between France and Germany. First World War, Second World War. But then after the Second World War, everything changed, and these two were among the founding members of the EU, which at the time was called European Economic Community. It was only economic integration. They have developed a practice of building joint strategies for over 60 years now. So this counts a lot. It means that there is, an established practice of cooperation, not going against the interest of the other, but trying to find common positions. Probably this has worked well enough until now, because in the end, if the EU has attracted so many other members, from 6 to 28, it means that this cooperation, this strategy, this leadership, if you want, has produced positive gains. Is this still the case? I mean, are these two countries alone able to meet the interests of the different members and produce these gains? Or is the EU now producing more costs? The UK, for example, clearly think that the EU is producing more costs than gains, to the point that they are ready to quit. That would be the very first time, quite impressive, and also the sign of a failure of the EU. So probably this cooperation is not, let's say, able to deliver anymore as it used to do in a community of 6 members or 12 members. What is the incentive then to rescue, bail out, and for the others to accept to be rescued and bail out? Well, there are so many synergies and interdependencies. If Greece was not rescued, this would pose a problem of credibility of the euro. And what are the main engines of the euro? Well, Germany, for sure. The euro has been created to reproduce what was before the German currency, the Deutsche Mark. It has been reproduced, on the basis of the functioning of the German mark. So really, Germany identifies with the euro. What are the largest economy in the Eurozone? Germany and France. If they did not rescue Greece, there would be a problem of credibility for the euro, because Greece is a Eurozone country. And also, Greece is indebted with German banks, French banks, Italian banks, and also with the German, French, Italian states that give loans to rescue. So at a certain point, it becomes almost impossible to let them fail. Because if you have them failing, then you have costs also, for your country, for your state finances. I mean, the money you have borrowed will not be given back. The bank system would be impacted because the Greek banks are indebted with the other European banks and so on. So you see, that's the problem, interconnectedness and interdependencies, I would say. So this makes, in the end, bigger countries and smaller countries to share the same destiny. So I'll let you think carefully about the EU government system. Don't hesitate to drop me emails if you have doubts, if you have something you would like to maybe expand a little bit. There is also a literature that I can recommend, and also there are textbooks in our library. In particular, there are textbooks on the EU system that you should all have a look at. I think. Otherwise, there is always the EU guide to EU institutions, okay? This is the official one. You can retrieve it from internet, and anyway, we will send it to you by email. Okay, thank you very much. See you next time.